Hello and good morning. My name is Sascha Fahrbach and you're watching Press Corner on TVP World from the heart of our Warsaw studio. Now, in our weekly Sunday chat about the week's most key events, we're going to discuss that with our colleagues in the media here in the heart of Europe. So let me introduce our guests. We have Bohan Hailo, editor-in-chief of the Kiev Post, and also Jakub Mielnik, journalist, Frost, and Mateusz Mazzini, journalist with affiliation with Gazeta Wyborcza. It's really lovely to have you all here. Welcome. Now, over the course of the show, we'll discuss this week's main stories from a unique perspective. Our top story is the continuing fallout from the IDF strike that killed 7 aid workers in Gaza, including 1 Polish citizen. We'll also look at NATO's 75th anniversary. Is it something to celebrate or to be worried about? The findings of the developing Russiagate scandal that has rippled across the German far right. Could that be a sign of more ominous things to come? And finally, we'll look at Slovakia's presidential elections, which seem to have sent a signal that Bratislava could indeed be moving away from a pro-Europe policy and closer to Mr. Orban and the Kremlin. So with that, let us begin. Press Corner. Our very first story is all about Gaza and Israel. So let's continue with that. Now, with that deadly incident, which has shocked the world and has claimed the lives of several humanitarian aid workers last week, a World Central Kitchen team working in Gaza was the target of an Israeli airstrike, one that experts say was completely preventable.
In the middle of an already bloody conflict, tragedy unfolded. The World Central Kitchen, one of the primary suppliers of food to Palestinians in war-torn Gaza, was the target of last week's tragedy. Just minutes after unloading 100 tons of aid at a warehouse in Gaza, the 3-car convoy of the WCK was struck. Despite closely coordinating their actions with the Israeli Defense Forces, 3 missiles hit the convoy. 7 individuals who held Australian, British, Palestinian, Polish, and dual American-Canadian citizenships were killed that day. The international response was swift and severe. The United Nations Secretary-General expressed deep concern over the safety of humanitarian workers and emphasized the need for all parties to respect international humanitarian law. Poland's response was particularly intense due to the death of a Polish citizen among the aid workers. A diplomatic crisis erupted after President Duda condemned the attack and demanded talks with the Israeli ambassador to Poland. Polish authorities demanded an apology and called for appropriate compensation for the family of the Polish aid worker. The Israeli Prime Minister called the strike tragic and unintended, while at the same time ordering an investigation into the causes of the incident. So far, the IDF has dismissed 2 senior officers who were involved in the attack on the convoy. However, the international community believes that more can be done to remedy the situation. Israel's government has expressed sorrow over the situation, but it is unknown whether going forward the lives of humanitarian workers will be more closely protected. So far, more than 200 have died working in Gaza.
Right, so obviously this whole tragedy in the Middle East continues to grip the whole world. It's become now a new tragedy on another level. Let's start with you then in terms of what this means, Jakub. The reaction from Poland, as we saw in the material, quite swift. How do you think this has been handled right now? What do you think is next for Polish relations with Israel?
Well, the Polish reaction was quite obvious because there was a Polish citizen killed in this incident, which I'm not sure if it surprised anyone given the scale of Israeli operation in Gaza Strip, and we have thousands of victims, civilian victims. We have also thousands of Hamas fighters killed in action, but there are also humanitarian organizations which are operating there, and they are on the front line. So the problem is that Israelis are using artificial intelligence to such an extent that there is a minimum human influence in decision making, in choosing the targets, in executing the strikes. This is all automatized. So this kind of incidents can happen, and I'm afraid it will happen. And as for a Polish government reaction. I think that was quite surprising from Israeli embassy that they were taking this quite hard ground, I would say, trying to minimize the responsibility for the attack, and just human decency shows that it should be treated as something as a way to extend some kind of apology or remorse for the incident. And at the initial stage of this exchange of communication, it never happened, and Israeli ambassador had an opportunity to visit few media in Poland and correct his stance, and he didn't do it. And this is like widespread impression in Poland that some political misunderstandings between Poland and Israel happen no matter what kind of government we have in Poland and no matter what kind of government we have in Israel. These are this is kind of common ground here, and I think it was quite an appropriate to stick to anti-Semitism in Poland, which is partly fact, as well as anti-Semitism in many European countries. In that regard, using this kind of argument was just a failure, and it's good that at the end of the day, Israeli ambassador expressed some kind of remorse and apology for that. Of course, there will be investigation in Israel about it, and probably some people will be punished for that. We are still dealing with the quite transparent and democratic country waging very unnoble war right now. Mm-hmm. So I hope that someday this problem will be solved.
Right, well, it gets more complicated by the day, but you said, I think probably, we actually had the ambassador here in our own studio last week, and I think there was some expectation for more sincerity, but I think it will be some time before those relations between Israel and Poland come back to some kind of normal. But I think one of the former ambassadors here said also that they've always been complex. I want to go over to you, Bonan, because I think this also connects, and you have experience with war in Ukraine as well. Your country is under attack currently. I mean, the battlefield is much more expansive and a little bit more, I think, complicated in another sense. But how do you interpret this? How has this rippled across into Ukraine?
Well, it's very regrettable and tragic that 8 workers have been killed. But in Ukraine this week, we've had that amount of civilians killed in Kharkiv during a night of Russian bombing. The difference, I think, that people see in Ukraine is they understand that the Israelis have wanted to defend Israel against Hamas terrorists, but the disproportionate use of force in the response reminds them of Russian methods, taking Mariupol, for instance, eastern Ukraine, just scorched earth policy in reverse, advance and destroy, as it were, indiscriminately, regardless of civilians, aid workers, journalists. Many journalists have been killed in Ukraine. So I'm not comparing Israel to Russia, obviously, I don't want to do that, but I'm saying that in war, terrible things happen. But if you're defending your land, do it in a noble way, as according to the international rules of the game, of the war, as the International Court of Justice has reminded us in this case. Avoid genocidal types of responses, which is just indiscriminate, punishing everybody that happens to be located where the terrorists or the culprits are. Yeah. So I would say that this, for Ukraine, this disaster, this tragedy is nothing surprising. It's very regrettable, and we feel for the victims. But on the other hand, it's a reminder that this sort of behavior cannot go, I wouldn't say unpunished as such, but without notice, with impunity.
Exactly, right. And also interesting enough that World Central Kitchen, I mean, they operate around the world, I think including also in Ukraine. They help many, many war victims. And I think that they were actually tragically invited by the Israelis to come and help in Gaza. So now we have this.
If I may just add.
Just briefly.
Very briefly, I want to commend very much the UN resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine, a Canadian woman. She's been very outspoken, and almost every day she's at these scenes of tragedy, destruction. But nobody in the world seems to take note of this.
Yeah, indeed, it's complex. Just want to touch on this, Mateusz, because we've just heard also the ICJ being called in like this. We seem to have a louder voice, also the international community, various international bodies now stepping forward and condemning more harshly Israel. Do you think that's going to impact at all a shift on the Israeli side?
Well, I think what we need to begin with is to observe a major shift also within European foreign policy towards Israel. Because if you remember, back in October, the support of European Union as such as an organization, including individual countries and individual governments, was very open towards supporting Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Right now, we do see a major change. Let's summarize what we've seen over the last week. We have the Belgian government announcing a move towards the recognition of Palestine as a sovereign state sometime within the next months. We have the Spaniards, the Pedro Sanchez government, promising to do the exact same thing, which is fundamentally important. If you remember that Sanchez was one of the very first European politicians that actually actively wanted to get involved in hosting peace talks between Hamas and Israel. So within just a span of a few months, we're moving from a unilateral support, unconditional almost, so to speak, of European bodies institutionally and individually towards Israel into a situation which is infinitely more complex, infinitely more detailed, but also seems to be heralding a major change in an overall foreign policy paradigm. And in that context, I think we need to read the Polish reaction, just briefly touching up on what we've been discussing already, the Polish MFA reaction towards the tragic incident and the death of the Polish volunteer who began his involvement with World Central Kitchen in Ukraine, which is also, I think, quite a symbolic fact in that context, is that the Polish reaction was, to a certain extent, I think, predictable, to a certain extent, proportionate. But let's observe the details, let's observe the wording. The Polish Foreign Ministry continues to refer to the conflict in Gaza as a special operation. You look at the statements published in X, formerly Twitter, on the Polish MFA account, very heavily criticized by a lot of people on the internet for not including the word war in itself, which provides a stark contrast to how the international community is reacting to it. You referred to the ICJ involvement. We remember the South African initiative to put the Israeli government on trial to try to hold them accountable for what's going on in Gaza. For many people outside Europe, especially in the global south, which is also of importance in that context, this is a war clear and unconditional, and the Polish MFA continues to use euphemisms in that context. Let's be frank about that. Obviously understanding that we need to maneuver within the broader dynamic of European Union foreign policy, so the Polish government cannot really stand out any further. But overall, even leaving America outside of that discussion for now, because I think this is going to be a separate block of our discussion today, we do see that Israel is becoming more and more alone in the fight.
Yeah, and I think also significantly one of the most pro-Israeli hawkish supporters, President Trump, or rather former President Trump, who's also, I think, this last week has come out saying critical words against Israel. So I think, as you said, Israel is standing more and more alone. But we'll talk about that a little bit further. Thank you for that first one. That concludes this first part. Let's move on to our second, going more into U.S. policy, U.S. relations with Israel. Now, the conflict in Gaza has not only affected the region, it has also sent ripples through the global political landscape. The countries who were previously closely tied to Israel have distanced themselves, and newly emerging powers are seeking a place at the table.
The war in Gaza has been a point of contention in Israel-U.S. relations, with differing perspectives on the conduct and objectives of the conflict. The U.S. has historically been a strong ally of Israel, but recent events have strained this relationship. The United States has exerted significant pressure on Israel, leading to what is reported as the first major concession from Israel during the 6-month conflict. The White House has demanded concrete, verifiable, and sustainable changes from Israel, especially after the attack on the World Food Kitchen convoy. Donald Trump, the former U.S. president, has publicly criticized Israel's handling of the war. At the same time, President Biden's stance has shifted from expressing unwavering support for Israel on October 7th to now urging Israel to stop the indiscriminate bombing of Gaza. Biden's criticism grew as he echoed calls from other Democrats to condition future aid to Israel on steps it takes to protect Palestinians in Gaza. More recently, the U.S. president called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza during a phone call with Israel's prime minister. In a move that signals a major shift in the U.S.'s stance, the United States abstained from voting on a UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. This abstention allowed the resolution to pass, further isolating Israel and indicating a new low in Israel-U.S. relations. With the U.S. taking a more critical stance and Israel facing increased isolation, the future of this long-standing alliance is uncertain. The war has disrupted the status quo and may lead to a transformation in international relations, with potential long-term implications for both Israel and the U.S.
Right, so we can probably say that the relations with Israel and their longest ally, the United States, are frayed. Now, 67%, that's how much of the weapons supplied to Israel from the United States, even if we see certain bans taking place by other countries that will not affect the major commitments by the United States. Do you think that's going to change?
No, I think that's not going to change. I mean, those political statements from U.S. are just a product of just human decency and media pressure, but long-term U.S. policy toward Israel is not going to change. And even short-term U.S. policy toward Israel is not going to change for a few reasons, and one of the major of them is a election campaign in U.S., where support for Israel is important factor among Republican electorate and also some parts of Democratic electorate. So the support cannot be stopped or weakened apart of those rhetoric announcements. The other thing is that the tranche of help military aid to Israel is closely connected to package of money for war in Ukraine, to support Ukraine in a war with Russia. So Biden administration cannot just block military aid to Israel without endangering a military package for Ukraine, and that's what they supposedly fight for, trying to unblock Republicans in a Congress. So I don't think it ever changed. Israel is really important for Middle East politics of America, and they've lost influence in several Muslim countries around. They have Iran as a main foe in the region, so they are not going to change it.
Right, so still a regional ally that's very important to the United States. And you rightly said so, that there has been very, let's say, positive, very regrettable words in terms of what's happened. But
yeah,
as you said, I think it was just recently that Mr. Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, was in Washington, guaranteed more contracts, more weapons that are being delivered. But nevertheless, Bogdan, let's touch on this briefly. I think the first time in a long time, out of that very, very ironclad support for Israel, seems to be changing in the United States, in the Democratic Party, also in the Republican Party. Is it too early to say that this is now going to be under greater scrutiny, that those weapon shipments might be reduced, that different policy might be more strong? Netanyahu reeled in? What do you think?
I think we've seen a game changer. You know, the U.S. has been the traditional stalwart defender, if you want, patron of Israel. But what we've seen in recent months suggests that things are changing, as many things are changing in the U.S., including aid for Ukraine. I don't think that's a given anymore, because now they're talking about making it a loan that has to be repaid as opposed to a gift. So for Israel, I think what has really changed since the days when, Trump supported the shift of the capital to Jerusalem, and the U.S., regardless of what minority feeling was fully behind Israel, well, fully behind, largely behind. Now I think with the response of the world, particularly the U.S.'s allies in Europe and elsewhere, this is also having an impact. The election is coming up in November, but though you showed demonstrations with Israeli flags, the majorities, the large groups that have been out demonstrating have been pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian throughout Europe. Mm-hmm. And that is something that has to be taken into effect. That's linked to immigration, the nature of immigration into Europe, the nature of the societal build-up in cities like Berlin, Paris, London, or whatever. And I don't think, I think we've moved on. We can't just assume that it's going to be politeness, bending to an accommodating concern, outrage temporarily, but then business as usual. Mm-hmm. I think, as I said before, we've witnessed, or we are witnessing, a game changer. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. A game changer. Just really briefly, Mateusz, because we want to go to the next topic. Just
quickly, because I think Bogdan's right on in taking the electoral issue into it, because it's not just about Europe and having pro-Palestinian demonstration here in Europe. We've had quite a sizable demonstration just recently in favor of Palestine in New York. There's a lot of pro-Palestinian sentiment in the Democratic, especially the younger Democratic electorate in the United States, not just because of the nature of migration, just generally. Muslim Americans seem to be very angry with Biden and his unconditional support towards Israel. And Muslim Americans, may I just remind everybody, were a sizable part of the electorate that voted Biden into office in 2020. So losing that support, I'm not saying that they're going to vote for Trump, that's very unlikely, but they might as well just stay home and not vote for anybody. And in states, let's just run this very quick intellectual exercise. We have states like Michigan, and I'm not mentioning Michigan here deliberately because it's a state with a sizable Muslim population, and we have an interesting number of independent candidates, like Cornel West, who's a liberal, progressive candidate, pro-Palestinian, the only one in the picture. He's not going to carry the state, but he's going to probably steal quite some votes from Biden and perhaps tip the balance in Michigan.
Yeah, but I mean, U.S. elections, that's still another huge topic. We're not quite there
If
yet.
I can just add to one sentence, short sentence,
because
I think that hardcore democratic voters in U.S., if they will face the dilemma Trump or Biden supporting Israel unconditionally, they will choose Biden supporting Israel unconditionally because he's not Trump. So that probably solves this dilemma.
Right, indeed. So, I mean, there's many more layers to all of this. But let's speak of politics some more and more locally in Europe. So in a tight race, Slovaks have chosen a new president, Peter Pellegrini, an ally of the populist Prime Minister Robert Fico. Could this now herald a shift of policy for Bratislava? For some time, many European capitals have feared a political swing of Slovakia away from Kiev and towards Moscow. Of course, let's now go to a quick clip of Mr. Pellegrini, who just recently declared victory. Let's roll that now.
I will do everything I can to ensure that Slovakia always remains on the side of peace and not war, whether anyone likes it or not. Let whoever and however they want criticize me for it. I am grateful to the citizens of the Slovak Republic.
All right, so there we have it, a new president. I mean, in terms of, let's say, political power, perhaps not so strong there, but at the same time, I think symbolically, Bogdan, let's start with you because I think it impacts very much Slovakia's move. We've had many statements. I don't know if we can roll that now. There's a political article with some of Mr. Fico's words in the last few months who have very much been anti-Ukrainian, to say the least. What does this mean for you? And do you think this is now going to potentially snowball in more opposition to Ukraine?
I don't think it changes much because Slovakia's position overall has been noted in Ukraine. I think the results are a disappointment because there was a chance that the pro-Ukrainian candidate might win in the runoff. So we see this axis now, Hungary, Slovakia. It depends very much, on the EU's response, the pressure that will be placed on Budapest and Bratislava to keep them in line, as it were. So we don't know how it will go. But obviously the rhetoric coming from these capitals are not going to be favoring Ukraine. And obviously Moscow must be very happy at this stage. But I think that more broadly is the split in societies that exists. In Slovakia and Hungary, despite the mass protests against Orban this weekend too, societies are split. But let's say the pro-Moscow, the Ukraine skeptic ones have triumphed in the polls. But look at Europe generally, with the elections coming up, the splits in society, the far right poised to make advances, and society is really split, sometimes by a very small margin, between those who favor a sort of more assertive policy and defensive policy vis-a-vis Moscow, and those who say, well, peace, let's just get on with our lives, and the Americans are to blame, and we have our own economic problems. And so I think what we see in Slovakia is a kind of microcosm of processes that work more broadly in Europe.
Right. And I think also we can see this article here from Politico there. There's no war in Kiev. That's Mr. Fico, I think not so long ago. And I think when he said, do you really think there's a war in Kiev? I hope you're not serious. Life there is absolutely normal. Followed by 41 Russian missile strikes. So this is now going to just get louder, I think. And I'm just curious, though, Mateusz, I know Slovakia is a small country. We know that. But in the scope of complex consensus building that we need in the European Union, that we need in NATO, now Orban has a friendly face, a very closely tied ally, now with Fico, now Mr. Pellegrini. There seems to almost be a kind of line building, a sort of split from just yesterday or a couple days ago, the Nordics, the Baltic states giving everything they can without a doubt as fast as they can to Ukraine. We don't see protests there. Is there a line building, an uncomfortable line, a split with Slovakia, with Hungary, and even to a certain extent Austria, that potentially is going to be a big problem moving forward with Ukrainian support?
I don't think the line is building. I think the line's already there. It has been for the past years, if not even a decade, just the rhetoric, the problem that's at the essence of that division within Europe might be shifting. It used to be migration. It used to be opposition to European Union climate policy. Now it's the war in Ukraine. But I think from a pragmatic point of view, the very fact that Pellegrini won that election, I think, Bogdan, you're right, that doesn't change much from an operational standpoint, because we know that within the Slovakian political system, the role of the president is largely ceremonial and symbolic.
But it gives him clout, doesn't it? It gives Fico
It gives
more
them clout, and it removes the last roadblock for Fico. Fico has been already a headache for both the European Union and NATO. We need to remember both of these organizations in their key voting procedures operate under the principle of unanimity, right? So we already have one obstructionist, who's Orban, who dragged Sweden's accession to the alliance for months on end, seemingly for no reason. And only at the end of that process, he actually admitted that he wanted to lease the Gripen aircraft for a longer period. Now we're going to have another country that might want to bargain or to use their political power, their vote in the European Union Council or in NATO to get very particular political benefits. And to what extent that is a line that the rest of Europe should worry about? I think yes and no, because we clearly see advances of different permutations of populism, not just right-wing populism. Fico is a left-wing politician, Pellegrini is a left-wing politician, but they run under very different agendas. And I think just recently, the European Council of Foreign Relations released a very interesting poll that showed that, yes, in particular individual countries, the far-right parties are making advances, will probably win more mandates in the European Parliament elections this coming June, but they differ inside that far-right camp, for instance, precisely on the question of supporting Ukraine, because we have politicians like Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, who comes from a very radically far-right background, but she is one of the most visible and outspoken supporters of Kiev, and then we have Orban, who's hesitant, we have Fico, who's left-wing populist and very skeptical, pro-Kremlin in some of his public statements. So I think we need to be very careful and try to avoid to make sweeping generalizations, because this is a very complex ecosystem.
Well, indeed, I mean, elections are one thing and the reality is another. Look, I'm going to get to you and more about Europe-wide policy, but I do want to move on to our next topic now, because we've already addressed now NATO, we've addressed Europe, and that's more we're going to go into. So looking at an unfolding scandal that's implicated Germany's far-right party, the AfD, allegations concern European politicians accepting bribes from pro-Russian groups at a time when the EU is preparing for parliamentary elections in June.
The Eurosceptic far-right Alternative for Germany recently came under fire after it was found that one member was suspected of receiving bribes from a pro-Russian network. The network, identified as Voice of Europe, is believed to have been paying politicians across Europe to disseminate pro-Russian narratives, particularly in relation to Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine. The political repercussions for AfD have been swift, with the party's leadership demanding that the accused member, Petr Bystron, to clarify his involvement. Bystron has denied the allegations, but the party has barred him from party events until further notice. Additionally, the European Parliament has expressed deep concern over the allegations. A motion for a resolution has been put forward, calling for a thorough internal investigation to assess all possible cases of foreign interference by Russia and other kinds of malicious interference in the work of the EP. This incident has heightened concerns about Russia's influence in European Union politics, especially with the European Parliament elections looming. Calls for an investigation into the activities of Voice of Europe have been made by various EU politicians. The scandal has also prompted a broader public debate on the vulnerability of EU democratic processes to external influences and the need for robust measures to protect them.
Right. So with that, I find that also interesting. Voice of Europe, right? They're in the European Parliament very much, but being very much against Europe and its core. How deep do these findings go? I mean, we've had right now one politician named. I mean, these sources come from the Czech Republic, so again, from our region. So how sinister and how deep are these links? Are we going to get more discoveries in the coming weeks?
Well, if we are asking about how deep it goes, we should think who is occupying Vladimir Putin's wine cellar, and this is former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. We should also ask who was promoting Nord Stream for years, and it was Chancellor Merkel, and who is blocking substantial and crucial military aid to Ukraine right now, and this is Chancellor Scholz. So of course,
he's not quite blocking it, I'd say. I mean,
well, okay, but he's not doing his best to facilitate these shipments. So it's hardly surprised that far-right groups all over Europe are influenced and paid by Russian security services, Russian oligarchs, people from around the Kremlin circle. This is not surprise. They were investing in those circles at least from 1920s and 1930s, when Soviet Union was cooperating with Nazi Germany. So this is, of course, a good shot for European elections, showing that there are groups who are gaining more and more support all over Europe, and they are anti-European and pro-Russian. But at the same time, and this is also related to the previous discussion about the outcome of presidential election in Slovakia and what's going on in Hungary, a part of very militant and very decent and wise rhetoric from major European capitals, we have this undercurrent of European policy, which is not changing for years, and this undercurrent brings, take some more consideration to the concerns of Moscow politics than what's going on in Ukraine or on Central Europe, or generally on the security of Europe. Some of our Western partners, they are just happy to exploit this pro-Ukraine stance because it benefits them during their own election campaigns, but their deeds are not so energetic and not so promising for Ukraine war effort.
Right. I want to come in on that point. An undercurrent potential of Russian influence that we can't seem to change. I agree with you on there that the Germans have been a bit reluctant in terms of weapons shipments. That, let's also state for the record, they have provided a lot. Nevertheless, let's make that clear for the record. An undercurrent, building on what you said earlier, is this something that is unstoppable? Is Russia winning this undercurrent war in Europe?
I don't think Russia needs to be winning that undercurrent per se. The very existence of the fact that this undercurrent still is observable is a sort of victory for Russia. We've mentioned Peter Pellegrini's victory in Slovakia. That's quite a literal link between Russia and Slovakia. If you remember, Peter Pellegrini was discovered to have been actively seeking an audience with Vladimir Putin in 2020, right before the previous Slovakian parliamentary elections, when he was the outgoing prime minister. He was losing in polls. He sought support from Moscow via Viktor Orban and via Peter Szijjártó, the foreign minister of Hungary. And obviously the Hungarians themselves calculated it would have been beneficial for them had Pellegrini remained in power as prime minister, so as the leading figure in Slovakian politics. So I think you're right, Jakub, to point out that everybody has very particular interests here in kind of forging support for Ukraine, or maybe the opposite, or maybe actually trying to tone down the war rhetoric, because there are elections all over Europe and people have particular interests. But we do seem to have a problem with that undetected, so to speak, of Russian support, which is not, let's clarify, just exclusively related to far-right parties, because if you look at the list of politicians who were interviewed actively by the Voice of Europe crew or who appeared on their YouTube channel, we also had left-wing politicians or politicians representing traditionally left-wing groupings like the Democratic Party in Italy, which is the main opposition faction in Italian politics, or Podemos, or any other sort of anti-establishment,
right,
so to speak.
So that unique link between very much far left and far right. I mean, that's the thing where they...
If you seek a common denominator, I would probably say that it's reluctance towards Europe. We see that also in Germany. We entered with AfD.
I want to jump on the AfD real quick at the end, just a brief comment, because it seems that even if we do show this kind of evidence, let's say to the average AfD voter, and they're very much also concentrated, not just in the east of Germany, but also more and more across the country. In Bavaria, it's polling very, very high. Will this really change their mind of support for this party, Bogdan?
To an extent, I think not overwhelmingly, but I think it will dent the support. I think that we're seeing through this exposure a kind of, shall we say, a greater awareness of what Russia's been up to, and the vulnerability of political parties, left and right, to getting this sort of soft support, financial exposure in media financed by the Russians, etc., etc. So the fact that this is being talked about at the highest levels now, and that it is a stir in Europe, going together with the context of war, the future of NATO, what's going to happen to US, I think it's turning into a wake-up call.
Right.
Right? We've had years of focusing on fake news, fighting fake news, you know, closing down some Russian channels. But now we're seeing the direct results of the not just fake news, but actual cultivation and buying of allies within the European camp. So, you know, I don't think right now it's going to make a huge difference, but a year, 2, 3 down the road, depending on how things go, it will have registered.
In politics, 3 years, that's a long time. Just also incidentally, as you said, I think one of the top tickets for many Germans, business lobby, was that, I think, tea time with Vladimir Putin, which was, I think, the business lobby really wanted, which I think many of them unfortunately still want, but that's another topic. We mentioned NATO. Let's talk about that as well. I mean, that was a big, big deal this past week because NATO celebrated its 75th anniversary. So what started out as an alliance made up of 12 countries has since then transformed into a global heavyweight with 32 members committed to collective defense.
NATO was established on the 4th of April 1949 with the primary aim of preventing the horrors of another world war. The alliance initially consisted of 12 countries, including major powers like the United States, United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Canada. Over the years, NATO expanded its membership through several rounds of enlargement, especially during the Cold War, to counter the Soviet Union's influence. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union marked a significant shift in NATO's focus, with former Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joining the alliance in 1999. This eastward expansion continued into the 21st century, incorporating several Balkan and Baltic states. Today, NATO plays an important role as the Russian war in Ukraine continues to unfold. The entry of Russian forces into Ukraine in early 2022 led to a renewed sense of urgency within NATO, resulting in Finland and Sweden's recent accession to the alliance. This expansion has fortified Europe's defense lines, although Ukraine's potential membership remains uncertain amid the ongoing war. The United States, which remains NATO's largest and most powerful member, is gearing up for turbulent elections later in the year. Leading up to the vote, voices have been sounding from across the nation to withdraw or greatly reduce the amount of aid sent to Ukraine. While President Biden's administration has shown unwavering support for both NATO and Ukraine, his predecessor's stance on NATO has been more critical, with suggestions of increased military spending by European allies.
Right, and just on that Trump note, really briefly, I don't think Trump has ever said to stop the aid, so I think this is kind of an interesting perspective. So NATO 75 years ago, what do you think? More celebratory or more muted?
Well, it was created 75 years ago basically to keep US in, Russia out, and Germany down, and it really stays after these 75 years. The only difference is that is in regard of Germany. 75 years ago, this down was meant to limit Germany militarism right after the World War II. Now, I think the main effort is just to limit the failed sense of pacifism, which is influencing German policy, and it endangers the efficiency of the alliance and Central Europe and generally Europe. So it really stays, and as long as it will work and the allies can cooperate and find a common ground, we will be safe. The problem is that we have countries like Hungary or Slovakia recently, they have their vote, and let's think about the situation in which we are in a direct confrontation with Russia, and we have a Slovak and Hungary so-called peace parties, calling for peace no matter what, because the peace is the most important thing. And the peace means that NATO is doing nothing to protect Baltics or Suwałki Gap or any other part of NATO territory.
Right.
This is the real challenge for 75th anniversary.
Right. I mean, infamously, Mr. Macron said not so long ago, Mateusz, NATO is brain dead.
Yeah.
So what do you think? The alliance back fully, it has a challenge to meet. What do you assess it as?
I think this is going to be an existential challenge, even though the alliance overall, from our point of view, is in good health, is resilient, is larger than it ever was, and we have to thank Vladimir Putin for the inclusion of Finland and Sweden into the alliance. But the real test, I think, is about to happen any weeks, any month from now, and I'm not just referring to the threat of a direct incursion of Russian troops into a NATO territory. I think the big challenge is how do we define a response within Article 5 should something happen on behalf of Russians. I'm not saying a direct invasion again, but a lone missile, an accident that actually kills civilians or destroys a critical piece of infrastructure. What would be a proportional response? Do we declare war? What kind of military action do we undertake? And how do we reach a compromise? Because again, as we've been discussing so far, this is still an alliance that's based on unanimity. And now we have more members, so we need to have a larger compromise. And how NATO deals with that, I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have that Washington summit soon, so we'll see what happens there. It's going to be key. Of course, Bohdan, final words. Ukraine is, of course, looking very much at NATO, isn't it?
Ukraine desperately wants to be part of NATO de facto, if not de jure, as soon as possible. And to a large extent, it is becoming so, as has been pointed out. Look, I see things for NATO. I wouldn't call it a middle-age crisis, but perhaps it's resembling that. You know, it's feeling pain in its joints, it's out of breath, it's perhaps not as prepared as it should be for the long journey still ahead of it. On the other hand, with the fear of what the US is going to do or not do, the good sign, Sweden has joined, Finland has joined, they're giving new impetus to this. Britain remains, you know, a stalwart member, and though it's not in the EU, through NATO, it's still part of that military alliance. Japan, South Korea have gelled together. So with the threat that Russia has exposed itself as being the purveyor of, this is gelling, I think, NATO, even if America is showing isolationist tendencies, potentially, and is forcing the Europeans to think about their future. And statements like Macron's that we wouldn't have expected 2 or 3 years ago, but perhaps we would if we'd remembered de Gaulle and his stance. And this emphasis on Europe, get your own act together, get your own forces in order, and don't just rely on the States. And we still don't know what's going to be happening with Turkey, say, after their local elections and the shock for Erdogan. Will he change his stance somehow more, you know, given that his hard line on Israel? What's Iran going to do? China? I think that the bottom line is that NATO has gone through a very difficult patch, and it became very complacent, and now suddenly it's had a wake-up call, and the moment of truth has arrived, this way or that way.
The moment of truth, but I think something we can all, I think hearing all of you, there is cautious optimism about this key alliance. We'll have to see where it goes in the next 75 years. So, but with that, we conclude this edition of Press Square. I want to thank my guests, Bohdan Mihailo, Mateusz Mazzini, and Jakub Melnik, who joined me today in the heart of Warsaw. So join us again right here on TVP World. Goodbye.